Right. Okay. I'm going to make a start. Welcome. What I intend to do, because there are new faces here, some of us are, should we say, the old guard. What I was intending to do was to get members to introduce themselves just briefly, and then officers to introduce yourself as they go through presentations, because all officers on here are pretty much destined to do presentations, unless Stephen wanted to do anything advanced as our lead advisor. Anything you want to do before members introduce yourselves, Stephen?
No, there's nothing. I will just say apologies from Dominic Morris.
Yeah.
We're still waiting on some members to join, but that's the only apologies I've received. But otherwise, go ahead, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go round as members look on my screen rather than alphabetic. No, let's be a gentleman. Let's say ladies first. Chloe, you're the only.
Hi, yes, I'm a member for Minchinhampton, and I'm also a district councillor for Minchinhampton.
Fine. Okay. Who else have I got? I haven't met the gentleman yet. So, Mr. Councillor Bloxham. Yeah, John Bloxham.
Yeah, hi. So I'm a new member and I represent Robborough Division. So I'm the successor to Brian Oosterhausen.
Welcome. And I remember Brian with great fondness. At least as in. Councillor Spivey then, if you would you care to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Councillor Lisa Spivey. I am the new member for the South Cerney Division, and I'm also a district councillor at Cotswold District Council.
Lovely, thank you, welcome. Who have we got? Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Hilton. I'm the County Councillor for Kingsholm and Wharton, Gloucester, and I'm also the chair of the new Scrutiny Fire Service Committee.
Right, now then who have I got? Stephen, as in Stephen Hurst, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm Stephen Hurst. I am a County Councillor for the Tetbury Division. I'm also a District Councillor for Cotswold District Council. And this is my second innings as far as County Council are concerned.
Okay. Dr. Miller.
Good morning, Phil. Good morning, committee. I'm Andrew Miller. I'm the chair of the Children and Family Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And I spent a year doing that in the last term of the council after Brian Robinson stood down from that role. In that time, I only chaired one in-person meeting. All the others were virtual. So still limited experience, I think, of chairing these committees. In the last council, I was also on the Permanent Exclusions Task Force and the Single-Use Plastics Task Force, which both reported in the last council. I'm not a councillor anywhere else at the moment, but I was previously a unitary councillor in Wokingham. So thank you.
Okay. So have I covered everyone apart from myself? Look at my screen now. Okay. I'm Phil Walford. I'm County Councillor for a misleading division called Hingham, which is actually made up of 21 parishes, mostly bordering the River Severn. So I've got a bit of a wet reputation. Timely. I see Ben Evans has joined. Before I asked Ben to speak, in taking this role, I did say to the leader that I would do scrutiny my way, and that is that irrespective of politics, everybody has a value and everybody has an input. We can deliver an awful lot. Okay, we know potentially sometimes things get political, but if we wish to give good advice to the administration, it's best we do it as a team. Ben just joined us. Can you introduce yourself, Ben?
Yeah, apologies for being late. There's a few of us had a bit difficult getting in. What do you want to know, Phil? Ben Evans, County Councillor.
You're my neighbouring councillor. Just as to which division?
Yeah, so I'm County Councillor for Churchdown.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Okay, I think we're all there. As I said,
Hang on, Phil. Phil, I think you
Phil.
forgot somebody.
Andrew, it's because you haven't got that lovely video up that you had earlier on.
No, I was buffering, so I turned the video off. So I'm Andrew Grewels. I'm a returning councillor. I represent Abbeydale Abbey Mead on the County Council. I'm virtually the same area on the City Council. After a gap of about 10 years, I'm returning to Chair Hosk, and I'm very happy about that. 6 years ago today, as a matter of interest, I was taking an interest in the health service at the Bristol Royal Infirmary, where I was undergoing pretty long operation for lung cancer. And so I've obviously got the NHS tattooed almost on my heart, real passion for it. And like you said, Phil, at the last meeting, the first meeting of the new HOSC, I made it very clear that I, as I had before, have no time at all for politics in scrutiny, none whatsoever, whether it comes from my party, anybody else's party. This is just a straight committee looking at the performance of the health service, and no interest at all in point scoring. That's for other places, not scrutiny, certainly not HOSC anyway. Thank you.
We hear you. Thank you, Andrew. Right, now then, sorry for missing you, Andrew, it's because you weren't on my screen. Stephen.
So I'm going to share some slides on the screen. So if we could have questions or discussion after I've gone through the slides, just because I can't see you when I put these slides on the screen, so I won't know who's saying anything. So just bear with me a second. Share the slide. Hopefully you can see those now. They are the slides that's in your pack, so they should be familiar. And for that reason, I'm not looking to take a long time to go through these because you've seen them. And I know that a number of you are returning members anyway, so have some knowledge and you know your stuff on this. It's just to make sure you're aware of some of the processes involved and a little bit around what effective scrutiny is. So your discussion just now segues nicely into it. The purpose of today in general is to provide the committee with an overview of some of the functions that you have and the areas of the council where you scrutinise. And then the idea is in your next committee meeting, you can have a consideration of work plan, having taken on board all of that information. So these slides on effective scrutiny are looking to just kind of introduce that for you and set it up. Scrutiny in general in Gloucestershire is well regarded. I mean, there was a little bit of a discussion earlier about the fact that some scrutiny work around the 2007 floods that was recognised. Health scrutiny in 2009, Councillor Gravels won an award for that. The social and economic impact of the Badger Coal, 7 Estuary Task Group won awards, and recently our budget scrutiny process has been held up in terms of being best practice, and I think it's had quite an impact each year in terms of going into your budget setting process. So that's just some examples of how scrutiny in the past has worked well, and just to give you some ideas going into the future. So let's just go through some of these slides. So the first slide, slightly low res version, but that is our scrutiny structure. So that should be quite familiar to you, and anyone that went to the joint session that we had a few weeks ago will recognise some of these slides. And there's you, corporate overview and scrutiny, sat above the other committees. And we'll go on to the terms of reference in a second, but you can see your position across the different committees. And you've also got the new fire scrutiny committee there as well. So that should be familiar. And those are the terms of reference, and I picked them directly out of the Constitution, so that's what it looks like. And just in terms of that, rather than read through it, just a few key terms to bring out, and that's strategic. You're looking to provide that kind of strategic role. Core council, which is the area of the council's business that you have responsibility directly for scrutinising. Coordination, whether that be some of the work the other committees are doing or whether that be task groups. And at the bottom, you can see it says overseeing the rules relating to the operation of task groups. So that's basically what you're here to do on corporate scrutiny. And the way you do it, that's up to you as members, but that's how it sits within the Constitution. And again, just straight out of the Constitution here, this is the scrutiny task group section. And it talks about then being commissioned by the relevant scrutiny committee. And it says there'll be no more than 6 scrutiny task groups in existence, and generally limited to 2 per committee. So that gives you an idea of how much work you can undertake, but obviously consideration needs to be given to resources, not just in terms of officer time, but in terms of your time as well, and not kind of taking on more than you can handle with that. Let's flip to the next one. And these are the Gloucestershire Scrutiny Principles. So these will be familiar to you as well. Something I will say is generally, and it's in bold there, good scrutiny reviews are narrow and deep, not broad and shallow. It's about picking topics that you feel you can really get to grips with, that can make a difference, and you can have achievable recommendations and outcomes, rather than trying to take on the world and take on everything. And I think rather than trying to make sure you have a committee and a task group that's covering absolutely everything, it's about being really, really clear about where your resources and where your efforts best lie, to achieve the most you can with what you've got. Also talks a little bit about a flexible approach, and it's about the way in which you scrutinise, whether it be through committee, task group, workshops, whatever that might be. It's about making sure that it fits the subject and the purpose. So it doesn't always have to be a task group that meets 5, 6, 7 times. It could be a one-day session like the 7 Estuary was. That was a one-day taking evidence. Or there was a task group on external care packages for older people, people with physical disabilities and learning disabilities. And that was a number of meetings because there was a lot of information to get to grips with. So as I said, it's that flexible approach. And right at the bottom, it talks about monitoring arrangements. And the idea is that scrutiny recommendations don't just sit on a shelf somewhere, that you follow up on them and you say, actually, we made those recommendations 6, 12 months ago. What have you done with those? Has it been accepted? Has it led to any outcomes? And you follow up. And at the moment, we do that for an annual scrutiny report, which you receive each year. And that talks about scrutiny activity over 12 months and starts to look at some of the feedback on what's happened. And as I was saying, that tailored approach. So these are a number of examples of ways in which you might wish to undertake scrutiny. And it will just depend on the subject matter, what members think is best in terms of achieving those outcomes. And it might be a workshop if you just want to find out some information. It might be a select committee type arrangement, or it might just be a visit somewhere to understand what's happening on the ground. And we often have visits to different services for members. And again, when you think about work planning, when you think about drawing up any of these scrutiny things, then that's what you would need to consider. And the one-page strategy, this is the way you do it, really. This is where you say, I have a topic idea, I have an idea for a review. And by scoping it out on this one-page document, what should become apparent is this a review worth doing? Can I see where the outcomes are going to be? Do I know how long it will take? Is this a worthwhile piece of work? And if it is, it then acts as a terms of reference for that group to guide you going forward and to keep you on track. So this is just a one page, and what you would do is you could fill that in yourself. You could fill that in with one of Democratic Services team, and then that could go to a committee for them to consider. But any member, if you've got a topic or something that you think would benefit from scrutiny, then this is your facility and your way of raising that with the relevant committee. So, as I said, I was just going to fly through the slides quite quickly. Let's stop sharing. Because I know you've seen those slides, you've been to joint sessions, and for many of you, I'm telling you things you already know. But if there are any questions, happy to take them, or if you wanted a more general discussion, Phil.
Okay. Just before we push on with questions, Stuart, my mate's joined. I see him, Joe. I did have members introduce themselves. I'll give you the same courtesy. We know you well, but there might be members who don't. So if you want to briefly introduce yourself, you're welcome.
Thank you, Phil. An absolute pleasure to be serving under your chairmanship. So yes, I'll just very quickly say I'm Joe Harris. I'm the member for Cirencester Park. The next time any of you in Cirencester, come and say hello.
Thank you. Your sound's not great, Joe, but later on, if it continues like that, we might ask you to put your video down. But you've got a lovely office set in there. Okay. Any questions for Stephen then? I'm looking to see if members, you've got the raise hand function. Nobody's waving. So can I then move on to the next presenter, who I think would be Steve Mawson, if I've got my running order right. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair. Yeah, sorry, that's me. I wasn't going to share my slides, so you can keep seeing each other's faces, if that's okay, because the slide deck is in your papers. I was just going to do a very quick whistle-stop tour of corporate resources. Now, this is the same presentation that we did at the induction. So for those members that were at the induction, the new members, you're getting a second bite of the cherry, if you like. And I'm also, for members that have been in the council for quite some time, at Corporate Resources is a fairly new directorate. It's a fairly new team that we brought together right at the beginning of, back end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and what a year that was for us to be having our first year in operation. So it's made up of lots of teams right across the function. And I guess for us, corporate also means council-wide. So we operate on a council-wide basis to provide services and support back to council-wide teams. So the first one is asset management and property services. So all our buildings and all our resources, and there's a big long list of stuff there in terms of all the things that they are getting on with: disposals, acquiring estate, moving bodies around and moving people around. The new Quayside building that we've got in partnership with the NHS, which I managed to get a look at yesterday, which is looking really good. So all the kind of buildings related and the technical building stuff, you know, the Legionella, the asbestos, all that kind of stuff that we have to do, and quite a lot of work with our schools and going in and out of schools to help them as well. Then the communications team, and you'll have seen a lot of resources coming out of communications team, particularly around COVID at the moment. But that just gives you some sort of idea of both the internal and external activity that they get up to across the council. So if we're doing a particular comms piece about highways or adult social care, they would engage with the service in particular and try and make sure that we get the message across. I'll let Paul speak for himself a little bit later when we'll come to the monitoring report, but we've got our strategic finance team that do a lot of work with services and spend a lot of time working with services, going through their requirements and helping them manage both their capital and revenue budgets, and also the pensions fund. And we operate the pensions fund for 200 circa employers across Gloucestershire, you know, schools, colleges, all that kind of stuff, the university, and also our own staff. So the staff work for us, but they administer the pensions fund, the local government pension scheme, the LGPS, for many bodies. Audit, risk and assurance, which is loosely named ARA. That's a joint service between ourselves, the City Council and Stroud District Council, and we operate across that. That's basically what you would call internal audit, and the aims of internal audit are listed there. Business Service Centre, which is part of Paul's area, also does all our paying and income receiving, and they run the temporary staff service. So we take on people and we try and fit them into jobs inside the county council. And again, we operate that service for some of our partners as well. And they all operate the SAP system, which is how we make payments and record all our payments and all our HR information, our recruiting information, etc. We've got strategic procurement, which is basically helping the council to buy things in a compliant manner. So we've got below threshold, which is currently I think it's about £190,000 for a non-works contract. So that means that we work to our own rules, our contract procedure rules that we've set up, and we've given you some examples there of the existing limitations that we've got on those different types of procurement activity. So procurement work across the council on a range of activities with children's and adults and highways and all sorts of teams, trying to get them to comply and work in a best practice. Policy performance and governance, which is Rob Ailiff's area. again, there's just a whistle-stop tour there of some of the stuff that Rob gets up to, and Rob is also the council's monitoring officer. So he will also explain a little bit what that involves later on. Human resources, or HR for short, and you can see the kind of activities that HR get involved in, all the people related activity. The organizational development team, which was, I think, in many councils years ago always underplayed, but actually is an equally important element of looking after our people and helping our people to develop. And then the occupational health team, which is helping out to keep people well and trying to keep people at work or as healthy as they can be whilst they're in work. And then the other part is also digital and ICT services, which has gone through a bit of a restructuring and partway through a bit of a modernisation at the moment. And I'm sure you might have some questions on that area as well, which Mandy also looks after, and we're heavily involved in an improvement programme that we're working on at the moment. So, and then there's a nice little picture of our slides. Although Rob was moaning yesterday that his slide has been changed position and his head's too pointy on that picture, and you can see it's definitely not that in real life. So I know that was a whistle-stop tour, Chair, but I know I'm conscious some members have seen that before, so I'm happy to take questions on any of those 8 areas.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going by the old-fashioned way of doing things and people raising their hands, so I'm looking for any raised hands for any questions. So, yeah. I see no raised hands. Whistle stop it was then, Steve. Next then is, I think you referred to him as performance reporting, and that's very much Rob's field of activity. Morning, Rob. If you want to make
morning. Shall I take you through my presentation, Chair?
Yeah.
Okay, Steve, are you able to share that on the screen just so I can see my own notes at the same time? That would be really helpful. I'll just pause while that's coming up. Members, I'm pretty sure I've met all of you at least once since you were elected onto the council. But just to remind you, my name's Rob Ailiff. I'm Director of Policy Performance and Governance. And as well as being one of the officers that supports this committee, I will be bringing once a quarter a regular report giving you an overview of the council's performance against its strategic objectives. So my aim with this presentation is to help you understand what you'll be getting. When I do that, the first of those will come to the next meeting of the committee in July. So this report is just to help set the scene for that and help you understand some of the information that we'll be providing you with. So if I could just have the first slide, Stephen. Thank you. So this slide just sets the planning framework of the council out so that you can understand how it is that we manage our performance and our priorities. We have 3 layers within our planning framework. We have the council strategy, which is a 4-year document that sets the corporate direction and priorities. We're currently in the 4th year of that because following the election, the incoming administration leads that process of developing a new council strategy, and the new strategy will work its way through to county council next February. In the meantime, we're still working to the existing corporate strategy. And that's the purpose of that is to set the broad corporate direction and priorities. It's an important document because it forms part of the council's budget and policy framework, and therefore we have to make sure that we're acting within the parameters that strategy sets in terms of the priorities and direction we're setting for the council and its services. Then once a year, as part of the budget setting and medium-term financial strategy process, we develop what we call commissioning intentions. You'll see those in the annex to the MTFS paper when that comes around in February. And that those set in more detail how we're using the council's resources to deliver and achieve those priorities over the next year. It will talk about the big contracts we're reprocuring, the big change projects that we're putting in place, and how we're managing and overseeing those. And that will give you a sense not only of the strategic direction, but what we're doing about it in the coming year. And then sitting beneath those Each service has its own annual service plan, which sets out their priorities and measures. And obviously, as you'd expect, we've got a golden thread running through those that makes sure that they all align and that the priorities and measures that are in place at service plan level are informed by the strategic direction of the council and vice versa. Next slide. In terms of more of the mechanics of how we manage and monitor that, then we have something which we call the corporate performance data set, which are those metrics and indicators that we use to track and monitor that council strategy at the strategic level. So I'll bring those to you, as I say, once a quarter in the form of a scorecard, and I'll show you what that'll look like in a few slides' time, that breaks down those metrics individually, shows you on a quarter by quarter basis how we're performing against each one of them and against the targets that we've set. But I'll also bring you a PowerPoint presentation that will tease out of that the highlights, the main concerns, the main issues that I think you as a strategic group of members need to be aware of and alert to. And that's your opportunity as well to challenge, question, and check that we're taking appropriate action in response to what that performance information is telling us. Now, inevitably, I have a fair amount of discretion in choosing what to include in that presentation, but that's the reason why we provide you with the full scorecard, so that you've also got sight of the things that I'm choosing not to tell you, and can also challenge me on that if you feel that there's something that I'm not giving adequate or appropriate attention to. So we try and make that process as transparent and as open as possible, at the same time as me giving you my professional steer as to what I think that performance data is telling us. So that content is based on two things: the performance data set, that set of around about 80 to 100 metrics that we use to track our main areas of service delivery and our corporate priorities, and also the council's strategic risk register. So the highest level risks that we're monitoring and managing as a corporate leadership team. And inevitably, because there's a huge amount of information in those reports, what I will tend to do is focus on the exceptions. So those areas where we're doing particularly well, or where we might have cause for concern and need to take remedial action to address our performance. Next slide, please. And as you'd expect, that whole process goes through quite a lot of quality assurance and challenge before it comes to this committee. So this arrow just sets out that process. It begins at the end of each quarter, where each service either uploads or enters its data onto our corporate performance management system within 2 weeks of the end of the quarter. That data then is compiled into a report that goes to each directorate's leadership team for them to consider and take action if they need to, and identify any issues that are emerging from it. I then bring a report to the corporate leadership team that pulls all of that together and highlights what I see as the key issues for us as a council. And that same information also goes once a quarter to a meeting that includes the leadership of the directorate, Steve, myself, and the relevant cabinet members, so that we're also making sure we are both accountable to the cabinet as the executive of the authority, and giving them the opportunity to challenge, but also equipping them with the information that they need in order to be accountable to the wider council. And then the final stage in that process, as I've said, is that data goes to scrutiny. It comes both to this committee for that broad corporate oversight, but also goes to the other committees, obviously just the section that relates to their performance, so that they're also able to maintain that oversight. And I think one of the arts of performing the role of this committee well is developing that sense of what are the issues that we as a corporate committee should be focusing on, as opposed to the performance issues that are best scrutinised within their thematic scrutiny committee. And I'm quite sure, that there's always an area of grey around the edge of that, and I'm quite sure that one of the discussions and debates we'll get into from time to time is this an appropriate focus for this committee, or should we refer it to one of the other scrutiny committees? But of course, the benefit of this committee is that we have the chairs of each of those other committees represented on it, and therefore it's very easy to take issues to and from those other committees and to assure ourselves that those are being looked at and given appropriate attention. Following slide. Just a few words about the corporate performance data set. One of the other conversations we will no doubt get into over the course of the next 4 years from time to time is, why do we measure the things that we measure? How have we come up with these? What are the gaps? What are the things that you're not telling us? So I just thought it'd be helpful to set out some of the criteria that we use. So the first one of which, and most important of which, is that it has to be relevant to what we're trying to do as a council. So our starting point is always the council strategy. What is it that we've said are our priorities, and what are the best measures that we've got available of whether we're achieving those? Second criteria, wherever possible, we try and find measures that focus on the outcome of services. I think that's important for a strategic scrutiny committee, that we're not focusing on the minutiae of service delivery. We're focusing on the difference that those services are making for local people. But that is always a compromise. It's not always possible to get good outcome-based measures, and so sometimes we do have to measure proxies, things that are outputs. The other thing is that obviously for some of our biggest service areas, they are subject to external inspection regimes, and in those cases it's important that corporately we keep sight of some of those indicators that the inspectors will be using to judge us. So you'll see, particularly in children's, not all of the measures are outcome based, but they are looking at things that are important factors in determining whether our children get good outcomes or not. So for example, we'll measure things like the percentage of time in which initial assessments are completed within the required timescale of 45 days. We'll measure how quickly we're getting out and visiting children and families once they're referred to the service. Those aren't outcomes in their own right, but they are obviously really important factors in managing the risks associated with children and young people. And they're in things that the inspectors, when they arrive, will be concerned about and giving close attention to. So it's important that we do as well. The third criteria is that wherever possible, we look for data that's available quarterly. The whole point of doing this isn't to give my team something to do, isn't to fascinate you with numbers. It's supposed to be about making sure the council improves and does as well as it can for local residents. And of course, in order to do that, we have to know that something's going off track and have the opportunity to put it right as frequently as possible. So wherever we can, we look for data that's available on a quarterly basis. And that sometimes means that we have to compromise on outcome-based measures as well. Often outcome-based measures are only available annually, whereas some of the output sort of data we can get more frequently. So again, there's a balance and a trade-off between these factors. And then the last thing that we try and do wherever possible is look for data that we can benchmark against other authorities. You'll obviously, all councils are delivering similar services and measuring things in similar ways. So wherever possible, we'll look for a measure that allows us to compare our performance against other local authorities so that you can see how we rank and compare both with the country as a whole and often with our statistical neighbours. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide. So I've already said that we set targets for measures whenever possible. How do we go about that? Well, first of all, as per the previous slide, we look at other councils' performance and we benchmark ourselves against those other councils. We won't always use the same benchmark group, and we won't always use the same benchmark because different services fall into different families. And so, for example, for Ofsted, we have a particular group of councils that they compare us against. So that's the benchmark group we use there. For highways, the factors are very different. It's much more to do with the amount of highway, the distance of highway we've got within the county. So we look for councils that have got the similar rural-urban mix to us. But in each case, we look for the best comparator group and we set our benchmark against those. For example, in children's services, increasingly, we aim to benchmark ourselves against authorities that are good and outstanding because ultimately that's where our ambition is. And so the targets that we set will be set against that group of authorities. Secondly, we aim for improvement. something is in our corporate strategy because we consider it to be important and something that we want to get right and get better at, and therefore we set targets that stretch ourselves. But we also try to make sure that our ambition matches our investment. It's not possible to be excellent at everything. It's not possible to throw all of our resources behind everything. So we have to make sure that the targets we're setting reflect the level of ambition that we've got. But as I say, by and large, the things that make it into the corporate strategy are the things that are important enough. We should be aiming for improvement unless we are already doing extremely well. And then the final bullet is just to assure you that targets are owned and set by the services that are responsible for those targets, but we do provide, my team provides objective and constructive challenge. So the value that we add into that process is by being slightly independent and being able to encourage services to stretch their performance by challenging it against things like our benchmark data. Next slide. So this is an example of the sort of information you will get. I'll say at the outset we're using a system that we are keen to phase out and replace, but the technology is moving forward extremely quickly in terms of data visualization at the moment, and we are on the early stages of a significant journey in this space that will see our data presented in much more user-friendly, much more interactive ways in future. And we've begun to roll that out with things like the COVID information that some of you will have seen, but also in the areas of children's and adult social care. But at the moment, we're still using our old system for corporate performance. And this gives you a sense of what the reports will look like. And what you've got on this, you may not be able to read the detail, but on each row of the table, you've got the performance indicator listed. You've got a cell that tells you whether, in the case of this performance indicator, we're aiming for the number to get higher or lower, because obviously different indicators have different polarities. There's some information about the basis on which we report. So some indicators will report cumulative performance up until the quarter that we're reporting, so performance on a year-to-date basis. For other indicators, it's more appropriate to give you a snapshot of performance at the end of the quarter. For others, we report the discrete figure for the whole of the quarter. It just depends on how the metric works and what the appropriate way is. Then in the grayed out cells, you'll get the historic performance for the last 4 quarters of that measure. The latest performance in the white cell next to that, and in the final cell, the target that we've set for that indicator. You'll then get a symbol that tells you on a red, amber, green basis whether we're performing better or worse than target, or significantly worse than target. And then in the final column, you'll often find there's some comparable benchmarking data where we've got it available for the period that we're looking at. So that's the full set of data you'll get that tells you how we're performing. Next slide. I also said you'd get the strategic risk register, and again we're working on the way that this is visualized, but to give you an example of what that looks like, you'll get the name of the risk, the owner of that risk, you'll get the inherent risk score, so that's how big the risk would be before we took any action to control or manage it. And then the residual risk score, which is the risk the level to which we are now managing to reduce the risk. And that's to give you a sense of whether the impact of what we're doing is making a difference to the extent of that risk. You'll then get some data on how that residual risk has changed over time, and an indicator showing you whether the risk is improving, getting worse, or staying the same. And in each case, we'll ask the senior manager responsible to provide some information on the mitigation actions that are being taken to control and manage that risk. So that's the information you'll get at a detailed level. That'll come out in your report packs a week before. And as I said, on the day of the committee, I'll present a presentation that tries to draw out the key themes. But in the meantime, you'll have had opportunity to look at that detail and decide whether there's anything that you want to question us on, or look at in more depth and detail. Because, as I said at the beginning, there are 80 odd indicators in this data set, I try to keep a working knowledge of all of them. but I'm more expert in some than in others, as you can imagine. So if you do have detailed technical questions, once you've got the report, it's really useful to me if you can email those either to me or to Stephen in advance of the committee meeting, just so that if I need to do a bit of homework before the meeting, I can do that and provide you hopefully with a more intelligent and illuminating answer on the day. Having said that, I'm a good sport and I've been doing this for probably more years than I ought to admit to now. So I'm always happy to take the challenge of a question on the day as well. It just may be that sometimes I'll need to refer back to you. Next slide, Stephen. This just shows you our risk scoring matrix. So on the previous slide, I told you that we provide you with an inherent and a residual risk score. This shows you how we calculate those. So we take two factors into account. How likely is the risk to occur? And we score that 1 to 5. And then we take the impact into account. How big would the impact be on the council of that risk occurring? And we measure those two scores together to give a score somewhere between 1 and 25. Now, inevitably, the corporate risk register ought to be focusing on the top right-hand corner of that risk scoring matrix. So you'll imagine that in risk registers across the council, there are hundreds of risks that we're tracking at any moment in time, many of which are in that lower quadrant. But for the corporate risk register, because we should be tracking, you'd expect us to be tracking the things that are business critical for the council, they will tend to be on the higher side, although there may be some exceptions. So you shouldn't be alarmed if a high proportion of those corporate risks are in those upper categories. That's just the nature of the corporate risk register. However, you should be challenging us to make sure that A, they're being controlled and mitigated so that that inherent score is being reduced, and also that the score is being changed over time. Next slide. Very nearly done now. This is just to set COSC's role and my team's role into the wider context of how we manage performance and risk across the council. So we have a 3 lines of assurance model. Those of you that are either present or former members of Audit and Governance Committee will also be familiar with this. So the first line of defence is those services managing effectively their own performance and risks. So that responsibility sits with the teams themselves, using the day-to-day tools that we provide them with to manage and track their risks. The second line of defence is support services, so the bit that my team falls into and my function falls into, where we provide those services with independent challenge. Directors provide them with management oversight. And obviously, there's also member oversight from Cabinet and from yourself. So you're part of that second line of defence. And then we have the third line of defence, which is independent assurance that the system as a whole is working effectively. And that's the role that internal audit play and the Audit and Governance Committee play. So it's not their job to manage and monitor the performance of the council on a quarterly basis, but it is their job to assure themselves that the council has effective systems and processes in place for managing its performance and risk. And that's the important distinction to understand between your role and that of the Audit and Governance Committee. Next slide. So in terms of some tips, as I've said, I've been working with this committee in various forms for probably over 8 years now, looking at quarterly performance. I think some of the things that I'd suggest for you to think about in your role in challenging performance, some of the questions you might want to ask yourself or ask us is, first of all, are we focusing on the right priorities? So is what you're seeing in the data marrying up with what you're hearing in terms of the things the administration are focusing on, the areas we're looking to improve? You should be looking for why performance has changed in a specific area. In some cases, that will mean referring issues back to the other scrutiny committees to pick them up with executive directors and directors in those areas. But most importantly, what are the implications of not meeting a particular target? There are lots of measures that you will see go up and down over the course of a quarter, sometimes by relatively insignificant amounts. The purpose of bringing them to this committee is to try and understand the impact on the local population. So you need to be worried less about minor movements over the short term and more about longer term trends, and in particular, what the impact of that is on local people. It can be very easy looking at performance reports for me and others to get lost in the technicalities of how we measure. Your role as elected members is really important and critical to that process in pulling us back to the impact on local communities and the impact on local people. And I think historically that's something this committee has done well. And assuring yourself that when we're looking to address that performance, we're doing so from that perspective of trying to make services better for local people. So my tips would be focus on what the performance is telling us overall, not on the detail of individual and specific indicators. Look for patterns and trends. But I'd also encourage you, and this is something that the committee has done well in the past, and I'm sure will continue to do, to ask questions and to challenge assumptions. One of the great strengths you'll bring to the process is that you're not involved in the nitty-gritty of this to the extent that some of us are. Those of us that have been working with this data for a long time will build up assumptions. We will get used to the narrative that we hear from services as to why something is the way it is. It's really important that you as members feel able to skillfully and carefully challenge and probe at some of those assumptions. And I will try and welcome you doing that. I do enjoy this aspect of the committee's life and the fact that I think we can get into some really good and interesting debates as to what the data is telling us and what we need to do in response to that. And I look forward to working with you on that over the coming years. The final slide just gives you some of the contact names for my area. So you know me. Aaron is my head of planning, performance and improvement, and you will occasionally see him at the committee. He heads up both the performance team and the data and analysis team, and the team that has corporate oversight of projects and programs across the council. And Kelly, within his team, is the performance and improvement team manager, and particularly focuses in at the moment on some of those service areas where we're looking to drive improvement, in particular children and GFRS because of their inspection regimes. But again, some of you will come across Kelly probably more in thematic scrutiny meetings than in this one. But Kelly is a fantastic officer that really does understand the detail of what it is that we're monitoring and why we're monitoring it and why it's important. And she's absolutely excellent at providing that internal challenge that we need in that role. So those are the key contacts. I'm really happy now to take any questions you've got off the back of that.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I've got my screen back. A good full presentation of those things, particularly around risk, etc. Members, I'm looking at members now. I noticed Paul Blackers had to leave us during that presentation, but.
Just to say that Chloe Turner has her hand up, and so does Andrew Miller.
Right. Zoe. Chloe.
Hi, thanks, Rob. And thanks, Chair. In considering whether we're focusing on the right priorities, do we also scrutinise the data set itself in terms of which indicators have been chosen and which haven't been chosen in the 80 or 100?
What we tend to do is once a year, we'll do a broader presentation that focuses on benchmarking. Most services we have some benchmarking information for. So what that should do is give you a sense of not only are the things we've chosen to focus on having the desired effect, but also are there things that we should be thinking about focusing on in future because we're slipping down the rankings or performance is getting worse. So that's the way we tend to do that. But obviously from time to time, you as members will pick up from the public, from your other scrutiny work, and just through being well connected within your communities concerns, and may ask for if we've got any measures to reflect that. So again, that's something that tends to happen every so often, is that members will come with an issue that they think we should be tracking and ask us what measures we might have to enable and help you to do that. And we're always happy to work with you to work that through and try and find suitable information for you.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. I can see Andrew's got his hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Phil. I thought it was a good question, Chloe, that last question. Actually, can I just go on and be a little bit more specific following that question? Can I encourage you, Rob, to consider the importance in our KPI set of surveys. And they could be both internal to Gloucestershire or external. So it could be, you know, a survey of staff on a particular issue, or it could be an external survey feeding back from our stakeholders on a particular issue, and to perhaps give some consideration to including that within our KPI set, because it can provide a good balance to the other sorts of data-based KPIs that we've got. So that's the first thing I was going to say. The second thing is to refer to earlier in your presentation, you mentioned the IT roadmap. I wonder if you could just refresh our memories and perhaps let the members of this committee have a copy of the latest roadmap, because I can't actually recall seeing it. Anyway, just my two penny worth there.
Okay. On the first point, Andrew, yeah, that's a really useful indication. We have better survey data in some areas of the business than in others. So in adult social care, with the exception of last year, for the reasons that we understand, we're required to take up an annual survey of service users and a biannual survey of carers. We didn't do that last year, but we'll be getting back into the swing of that this year. So that gives us really good data on how they feel about the services that we're providing them with. And actually, we generally score pretty well on those indicators. In other areas of service delivery, we have nothing at all. And so it's a point well made, and I think one that we always try and give consideration to. And I think it's something that we'll probably discuss over the next couple of months in relation to developing the next council strategy as well. So I'll happily feed in your views on that. On the IT roadmap, I mean, my reference specifically was to what we're doing around business analytics, and just give you a very quick snapshot of what that's involved. So we've now installed the kind of the software and the technology that will enable that to happen. And this isn't the area in which I'm expert, so forgive me if I sound a little bit vague. But basically, we're using the technology we've adopted is Microsoft technology, using something called Microsoft Azure, which is where data will be stored, and then we'll use Power BI as the visualization tool for displaying that data. Those of you that look on things like the BBC website at some of the COVID information, that's using similar sorts of technology, so very interactive graphs, very clean displays, very easy to interpret, and intuitive data. That's the direction of travel. And as I say, so far we've got that deployed in terms of tracking COVID, but we're also using that increasingly as the basis of our reporting of children's and adult social care data. Beyond that, at the moment, we've got a long list of service areas that over the next 2 years we want to deploy that to, but that list isn't yet prioritised, so we haven't yet decided what the next phase of rollout would be. But I'm pushing that corporate performance should be towards the top of that process. So my hope would be that within the next 12 months, we begin to see an improved display of data to this committee and the other strategic audiences that we produce that for. I'll hand over to Mandy to talk more generally about the ICT roadmap, because that falls within her area rather than mine.
Okay.
So if that's okay, so the short answer is yeah, we're currently pulling together a specific briefing for members, so you understand what's coming down the line. But the summary of that is that we absolutely accept the ICT isn't where we need to be. There's a history of underinvestment and a difficult provider. There's lots of reasons for that. But as a consequence, over the next year, there is an absolutely fundamental refresh, including the complete network in terms of how you connect in terms of remote access, the networks in the building, in individual buildings, and how they connect the buildings. So a complete refresh of the network and the connectivity. And we are rolling out a cloud-based version of 365, which will completely update and bring up to date how we use our systems. And that includes a replacement of BlackBerry Works and the mobile platform. So it is all on this plan. We're putting that together in a picture, if you like, and some key messages for members, so we can share that really soon.
I'm really pleased to hear that. As you, yeah, it's the right strategic direction. Power BI, yeah, it's a great tool. I use it a lot myself. So that's all great. And I'd love to hear more specifics, perhaps on another occasion.
Thanks, both. Can I ask you both take your hands down? Because I'm looking to see if anyone else is indicating with any other questions for Rob. Thumbs down, yeah. Okay. Now, as we saw earlier, Paul had to leave the meeting, so the next item is on finance. So I presume we're going to go back to Steve.
Yeah, that's fine, Chair. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Paul's had to leave. His wife's not very well at the moment, so he's had to take her to a hospital appointment. So what we brought today is a copy of the similar copy report that went to Cabinet yesterday on the outturn report. You will get a financial report at every meeting. That is certainly the aim. Sometimes the timing of the meetings doesn't quite right, and we have been looking at that for the timing of the meetings to try and at least make sure that you're getting regular financial updates. I'm not going to go into too much detail, Chair, and I'll allow for questions. Just a very, very quick overview of the 2021 financial year. I mean, it was like no other, I guess, and like no other I've seen in my career in terms of managing the corporate financial picture. In that, when we started with the emergency, and it started to kick in financially from April/May, really, we were very concerned about the impact on services, particularly in adult social care and in children's. And obviously they account for a very large proportion of the council's spend. I have to say that we heard from government very early in the year that they were going to support us through the emergency, and they did so. I have to say, I think they gave us more and greater allocations than we probably would have hoped for in the initial stages, and we were very conscious about not going crazy with some of the money and trying to work out where the issues were and making sure that government were giving us appropriate support on that. And you will see in the report, there is a plethora of individually focused grant activities around social care, quite considerably, but around a range of issues, particularly a container outbreak management fund, to make sure that the local government had the right resources at hand to be able to deal with the issues that were coming up. So last year was massively overcomplicated in terms of the grant treatment that we get, and we're used to dealing with lots of grants. And if you go back to the budget report, you'll see a plethora of these individual, specifically grants. What it also meant from a monitoring perspective was that it was very hard to monitor and predict the final outturn picture in terms of whether we were likely to come in on budget with loads of spare resource from a COVID perspective, or we need to dip into our own reserves from a COVID perspective. And the good news is that we were able to maximise the use of the grant and allow some carry forwards on a range of COVID. And the impact on the general fund was that we underspent by 3.53 million, which will go into reserves. There's a bit of a nuance in Gloucestershire's position on reserves that I'm looking to change over time. What we've tended to do in the past with our general reserves is they've almost sat on this ornamental shelf of reserves and never been touched. And we don't use them at any one point. That's not normally how you use your reserves. Normally reserves are set aside and you go through it in the budget setting, and we did this time a very detailed analysis of some of the risks that might hit us in that reserves, but you do normally call on them in year, and then you put money back. It's a bit like your rainy day bank account. You know, you do need to call on that at a time. If your car breaks down or you get an issue in year, you have to call on those issues, and then when you've got healthy times, you put money back into reserves. So I'm trying to change that over time, that actually we will put money into reserves and that we will then need to spend some of that money as and when issues come around, and you know, trying to spell out those risks as far as possible. in the budget setting, but there will be issues, and we'll stay inside the budget and policy framework which we set, etc., for that activity. So that's a slight difference to the approach on the use of reserves that we've been seeing in the past. And some of the discussions that we will be having in the coming year are also going through the list of earmarked reserves and seeing if there's anything that we could release that isn't needed anymore, and the activity that it was set aside for isn't needed, or time has moved on, etc. So we'll be looking at that activity as well. So, like I say, it's a bit of a strange year for us last year, but we tried our best, and I think certainly the council didn't go crazy on spending loads of extra money on things that were then going to be replaced by central government grants. The other success, I think, was working with district councils, and I know we've got a number of colleagues on the meeting who are district councillors as well. I think we had a really good joined up approach with district councils. Myself and Paul were meeting regularly and weekly, and still are, with Section 151 officers from the district councils, and obviously we were mindful of the grant regime they were getting as well. So happy to leave it there, Chair, and take questions as appropriate from the report.
Thanks, Steve. I'm looking for raised hands, but if that's not working for people, please literally wave it. You're ready, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was looking at page 12 or page 44 of the whole document, and that's to do with the increase in the earmark reserves of £46 million. But when you go to the reserves spreadsheet on Annex 3, most of the reserve funds are missing from that spreadsheet. So I wonder why that's the case on the documents we've been given, because when you look at the additions within that block, it doesn't come to the £46 million. So there must be other reserves that are being boosted, and we haven't got the full information. So can you tell me why we haven't? Normally you would have the full list of earmarked reserves on the spreadsheet, that we could see the money coming in, the money going out, and there's usually a note to tell us what it's been reserved for.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you're right. I think there's something missing there. I think there's almost a page dropped off the list.
Yeah, I can't find.
Oh, hang on.
Yeah,
hang on. If you scroll down, there's some a bit lower down, isn't there? Something that laps over page 27 and 28.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I'll double check that, because I think there's something missing in the formatting, really. I think.
Yeah, page 28 is I think the schools grant, which I wasn't interested in because we don't really control that. Yeah, it's probably the formatting.
I think something slipped on the formatting.
Sometimes I get problems on my iPad with formatted documents anyway, so it might be that I'm reading it on the iPad and not on the modern.gov on their laptop. I don't know.
Yeah, and the other thing, what I might do, if it's okay, is circulate a copy of. We will shortly, if not already, actually, have issued the draft statement of accounts, which has got. I think I signed that this week. So that will have a full breakdown of all the reserves. Now, there's a lot more detail in the statement of accounts than members probably need or want. But actually, that is the full reconciliation. So it's a good point that you raised, Councillor Hilton. So I'll double check that. But that's normally what the schools figures is normally what bumps the numbers up to 140, 150 million kind of area.
And I mean, and the other one is, do you know what the 21.999 million pound in the general fund balances? How does that compare to the budget? I haven't done a quick calculation. Is that must be above the 4% now? Is it?
4%'s a red herring. I'm not using the 4% anymore. 4% calculation was a district audit. I mean, it shows you how long ago it was. District audit calculation that used to happen. I'm not using that 4% calculation anymore, because it's not. What you're supposed to do is carry out a full risk assessment of the likelihood of you needing reserves and for what matter. And in actual fact, one of the issues that we have coming out of last year and into next year that is a bit of an unknown, and we need to keep an eye on, is the the impact on COVID on our services that we deliver. So the single biggest one that I'm concerned about at the moment is children's social care. I think on adult social care, we've got a better handle and a better grip for all the work that's proceeded in the past on adult single program and single conversation and all that kind of stuff is serving as well, although the market is still a little bit difficult. But on children's social care, we don't yet know the impact. My observations were through last year, we started to see a better stabilization of the costs and predictability. And actually, if you clocked the monitoring reports that went through the year, the children's social care cost, the net cost to the council actually came down finally in the outturn. I'm not yet convinced about the impact of COVID through that, and particularly the impact on vulnerable children that we've seen. So I think both in the monitoring reports here and the Children's Committee, I'm sure we'll be looking at that. We need to keep a close eye on that in terms of what the impact is, not just for this financial year, but going forward in terms of does that hard bake in some costs that are going to take us 2, 3, 4 years to recover from. So actually, when you're talking about the general reserves, that is one of the issues that I want to keep an eye on, because actually that could very easily impact on overspending this year and future years. So, we do need to keep an eye on that.
It's good news that the outturn for children's services is showing a positive figure, because I can't remember the number of years when we would increase the budget by £10 million. We'd all be glad we were doing that, and then find the service at the end of the financial year overspent by another £10 million. So at last, we seem to have got the budget we're setting in February at a level where the children's services can meet the targets it's been set, and it's spending. It's not constantly taking more and more money away from the reserves. We're budgeting correctly for children's services now, but to some extent the same with adult social care. I know these services are difficult to finally balance it, but it's good that both services seem to be funded to the level at the beginning of the year that delivers an outcome which is balanced. So that's good news, I think. Though it's cost a considerable amount of money to boost children's services to that balance.
Okay.
Thank you. I see Chloe had indicated. Are you still with us, Chloe?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I was just trying to get back in. I wondered, and I'm not sure whether it's a question for this meeting and for the audit really, but just will councillors have any training on the council's procurement, the way you do procurement, basically?
We can arrange that. At the moment, we are looking, both myself and Rob have been doing some looking at the current rules that we have on our procurement, and we think they need a refresh. We think they need some work and a bit of updating. The rules have changed anyway, as you're aware. We've left the EU, and most of the old rules were in relation to the EU. So we have had the adaptation in terms of the EU rules, but also I want to look at some of the levels and try and get the pitch at the right level in terms of the support and oversight that we need on the right contract stuff. So, for example, stuff above £100,000 is probably better to get involved and make sure we're tackling all those, rather than all the stuff at 10, 12, 15,000 pound kind of stuff. So I think the levels might need a bit of an adjustment. Once we've done that, I'm more than happy to spend some time with councillors doing training and support and updating on what I guess what I'd urge is that we don't do that too soon until we've looked at the rules, because what I don't want to be doing is training you on a set of rules that we're going to change. And the other observation is that we seem to be a little bit focused on the people that are authorising it rather than the service. So we talk about the Assistant Director of Procurement being a person that authorised some stuff, whereas I'm used to, we actually talk about procurement looking at that service and legal and all of that. So again, I want to do a bit of benchmarking in terms of what others are doing in that area and whether we're up to date on that stuff. But overall, I think our rules are pretty good. I think they're fairly okay. I had to do an overhaul of some rules a few years ago, and they hadn't been updated for many, many years. I think ours were updated 7, 8 years ago, maybe. or 7 years ago. So they're not that out of date, but they certainly need a refresh and a look at. But once we've done that, I'm more than happy to spend time with members, either as in this committee or as a separate workshop. And maybe it is a matter that we'll take to audit committee, because in terms of that oversight and governance bit, that probably falls a little bit more into audit committee remit than it does scrutiny. But happy to take the discussions wherever is appropriate at the time.
Thank you. I'd find that really helpful.
Thank you. John Bloxham.
Yeah, it was just a request, so thank you for the presentation. Is it possible to be supplied with a glossary so that where there are terms and abbreviations, we've got a simple glossary where we can look them up? I appreciate that where they occur on multiple occasions through the document, on the first instance, it will say in brackets after it what it is, but obviously, it's much more difficult where the same terms keep popping up throughout. So if we could have a simple glossary in alphabetical order, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I'll certainly try and have a look at that. Thank you.
Andrew, as in Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up on some points related to procurement and two very separate points. And thanks again to Chloe for raising it. And Chloe might be particularly interested in this. In the last council, the single-use plastics task force looked at procurement, and we had a commitment to developing a procurement toolkit, which I had assumed would be incorporated within the procurement rules of the council. So a little bit surprised, Steve, that you didn't make reference to that, unless, of course, the procurement toolkit hasn't actually been formally included in the procurement rules of the council. Do you recall what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about, and one of the things that I've established in the last month is a procurement transformation board, because there were a number of different strains of activity that were taking place that weren't being coordinated across the council and weren't being coordinated in the right way. So, for example, at a transactional level, when we raise orders, we're not tying that up best with our contracts that we've got around, and that just doesn't make sense. It happens eventually, but it's a bit clunky. So we've set up a group to look at that, and the procurement toolkit is one of those activities that we want to look at. Now, the first version of the toolkit the first version of the headlines I've been given on the toolkit has something like 136 different areas of investigation that they're trying to examine. So it feels to me it's too big, and we need to do a bit of a slimming down exercise to take that to task. The toolkit, of course, would not sit inside the contract procedure rules. The rules are the rules. The toolkit is best practice and how you apply them. So the fact that we are making it a guidance to make sure people don't do plastics is absolutely right, and I'm not challenging that approach at all, but that would sit in the toolkit as a guidance document, not firmly within your rules. So they are slightly different, and what it also means is that we can be a bit more fleet of foot in terms of changing the rules than we can, a bit more fleet of foot in changing the guidance than we can in terms of changing the rules, because the rules have to go through Constitution Committee and all that, and then have to come back to full council to be voted on. I am a bit nervous about the toolkit at the moment because it looked way too big for what we needed in terms of a simple set of guidance to be able to get these things up and running and a lot simpler to operate.
Right. I think in that case, what I would like is if you could bring back either to this or to the Environment Committee, just an update on where we are on that in future.
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, that was my first question. The second question was, you talked about levels and procurement. One thing you didn't talk about was general commercial awareness amongst GCC staff. Potentially all staff could be involved in the procurement process at one stage or level, if not actually making the decisions, then operating contracts. Are there any plans to roll out wider commercial awareness sessions for perhaps lower level down members of staff, possibly with a view to pushing down responsibility for procurement at a later point in time?
Yeah, I guess for me, what you're saying is a training package that supports the new rules that we'll be doing, and I totally agree with that. I think,
yeah,
I think depending on your role in the service, and we need to be clear of who we're expecting to be carrying out those procurement activities. I think we do need to make sure people are commercially aware. I and my team are going to hate this, but I use this mantle that we need to make it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. So we have to help people and train people and support people to be able to do the procurement activity that's appropriate for their level in an easy to understand way. So that's frameworks, framework agreements, collaborative procurement activity, whatever you want to call it, dynamic purchasing systems, where it's easier to call off the things that you use on a regular basis and not having to go through a lengthy 6, 12, 18 month procurement activity. But if it is something that's big and dynamic and expensive, that you should go through a proper process that's in accordance with the UK procurement rules. I keep stopping myself from saying OJU, but that you do stuff. So we do need to, and that's my concern about the current rules, is that we seem to be concentrating the effort and the energy in slightly the wrong places. So yes, we need to update and modernise our rules, and you're right, that does need to go hand in glove with a training package for all levels, depending on what your role is and where you sit in that. And if you're if you're the person that's left with the job at the end of the day of going onto the system and raising the orders, then you've also got your training and support, and you understand where you're going. So I think one of the things that we've identified in the procurement transformation work is that the training and support package is not sufficient for all the people at the different levels. So I don't think it's not just about the commercial bit. I think there's an internal lower level training package as well about how do I do my job to make sure I know where to go to get the advice and expertise.
Good. I mean, clearly we have to keep to managing public money and the UK procurement rules, but also my concern as a councillor is that we get the best value for our public, and that might mean as much a change in culture and an improvement in commercial awareness and value for money amongst all members of staff, because they're not actually just the person who signs off the contract, it's also the people that use the contract, who call off when the contract has been, and all the other things that go with it. So that's really what I'm driving at. But thanks, I think that was a good answer.
Yeah, just one other thing that I'm keen to push on, and we do this, but I don't think we've built it into our rules as much, is local spend. So we've had a long conversation about anchor institutions, and I know Colin Chick has been pushing on some of that work. I think there's a duty on us as a large employer and as a large provider in the local area to make sure we're also encouraging local spend. Now, sometimes that's a little bit challenging depending on the particular activity that you're doing, and you above a threshold you still have to do wider stuff. But we also should be encouraging our local providers and our local suppliers to be able to get on. Now, that's probably going to mean extra resource that I need to dedicate to do that and to make sure that activity is taking place. But I think it's a worthwhile activity, and certainly in the current climate of recovery and COVID recovery kind of stuff, it is definitely worth something, a longer discussion. So we know that that's one of the things that we want to encourage. In other places, I've even built it into the procurement rules that where possible, one of the quotes or tenders or whatever, you should encourage a local provider, so someone with a Gloucestershire postcode, to be able to put into that bid. Now, that's not always possible depending on what it is you're procuring, but I think it's something that we should at least aim for.
Okay. Any other questions? Andrew's hand's still up. If you can put your hand down again. Yes, Chloe. Yeah.
All right, there's another one where I'm not quite sure whether this is the place or whether I should save it for the audit and governance session. But Colin Chick the other day was talking a bit about social value accounting and trying to build that into the council's processes. And I wondered whether that will be reflected in the indicators that we're going to be looking at, or in our sort of consideration of how the council's doing in its strategy.
I don't think it'll be in indicators specifically. I think it will be in that there will be a policy document that we'll want to approach. And unfortunately or fortunately, social value is very flexible. So I mean, the example that I always remember was the rural village post office that they tendered for a rural village postal service, and they managed to get built in that they would pick up people and bring them into the major conurbations. You know, that was a social extra that they were building in for that local village that was really important. So yes, we are coming up with a social value strategy that will sit alongside the procurement activity and you know, will be an aim in terms of what we want to do. I think it's the measure of it will be quite challenging. So I think we probably need to think about that a little bit more when we're dealing with that strategy, because it is a little bit hard to put an indicator on it, if you like. It's something that's and by its own definition, it's a little bit more harder to measure kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I think it needs to be done to recognise that, you know, we can't do it and then not measure it. So we've got to find some way of sort of
yeah. I mean, one of the indicators I've seen in other places is the number of contracts that have a social value clause. You know, so that's a very easy very easy measurement, and should improve as time goes forward. The depth and the quality of that clause is something that's a little bit harder to measure, of course, isn't it? So it should be an easy tick in the box, that one. But actually, once you've done that indicator, there's also a next level, which is the quality and the depth of the social value clause in those contracts.
Yeah, and I completely accept that our early attempts at measuring it might be quite clunky, but at least it's a move in the right direction, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, John, your hand went up and then down again. Have you got another question? As in John Bloxham.
No, that was in relation to the previous item. I mean, just to pick up on that last exchange there. I mean, I agree with what is being said. The challenge, I think, is to look at what the outcomes are, because typically the sort of social value clauses will have something in that's an expression of sentiment, because it'll talk about something like using best endeavours where reasonably practicable, etc. So what the clause actually amounts to in practice is often not deducible from reading the words. You've got to get under the bonnet and say, well, what's actually changing and what are the outcomes that relate to this aspiration?
Yeah, fair comment.
Good point. I'm looking for any other hands. No. Just let me check my agenda and see where that takes me to. I'm going to defer to Stephen now, I think.
That takes you to the end, Chair.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you got anything that you wanted to bring other than the items that we've had presentations on? Is there anything else, any legacies left over, for instance, from the previous Corporate Scrutiny Committee? I'm thinking because there is the one task group that's yet to be formed, isn't there?
So I was going to say, obviously, this is a member induction session rather than a formal committee meeting. So when we do have a formal committee meeting, at that stage, there will be some leftovers in terms of minutes and things we need to sign off. But also, there is a task group, which I think members will be aware of because it's gone to group leaders in terms of looking to get membership for, which is on Rivers, isn't it? So that is about to start getting nominations for that one. At your next committee meeting, there will be an opportunity as part of work planning to identify items for this group. And with your other scrutiny committees, there will be opportunities to identify areas where you want to scrutinise further, whether that be committee or task groups. But yeah, the only hangover is that one task group, which members should be aware of.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for the it's not bad, hour and 25 minutes. Thanks for the engagement. Look forward to the next one. And timely, because I had another meeting that I could join at 11:30. So thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you.